One of the very few perks of living with a rare terminal illness is nothing ever seems important enough to get stressed about. I'm speaking from my own limited experience. And in no way would I recommend you go out and get your own rare terminal illness if you don't already have one. But in my case, I was able to make peace with the reality of my impermanence early on. Before the diagnosis, when I was a teenager, sometimes I would worry about living up to my own expectations of adulthood, which is absurd if you consider the town I grew up in is the capital of lowered expectations, whose only claim to fame is being the home of a bloody Civil War battle and the place where it rained frogs at one time. Don't ask, it's not as interesting as it sounds. I work at the 24-hour gas station at the edge of town. As far as it goes, it's not the best, but it's not the worst either. Knowing that I won't be here too much longer dulls any ambition to climb the corporate ladder. Some days churn by without incident, moving one step closer to oblivion or whatever. Those are my favorite days when I could just pass the entire shift reading a book and minding my own business. I don't need to climb a mountain or visit the Grand Canyon to know what Zen feels like. Tranquility is a quiet, empty gas station at 4 a.m. Of course, some days aren't as uneventful. I've experienced rude customers, drunkards, vicious raccoons that fall on the chaotic evil spectrum of the D&D alignment, a handful of armed robberies, and other things I can only describe as weird. I had one of those types of days yesterday. We had been busier than normal in the weeks leading up to this. Some of the wildlife and fishing agents from the neighboring towns had been patrolling the woods pretty heavily, and our gas station was the only place for miles to get fuels or fresh coffee. I don't know what the hubbub was about, but I would guess everyone's been on edge since those cows were mutilated. Okay, maybe mutilated is too strong of a word to use. Somebody had been sneaking onto the cattle farms and shaving the cows bald. Who knows why? Small towns get bored. I wasn't paying attention to the time because I never do, but it was late in my shift, middle of the night, when the deer poked his head inside the gas station. I had just finished my book and was checking my phone for weather updates when it happened. The glass door was pushed slightly ajar. The large deer, with an 8-point rack of antlers, was slowly inspecting the store, scanning its gaze from one corner to the other, nostrils flaring with each sniff. It stopped moving and pointed its giant black eyes right at me. I remained perfectly still, except to put my phone down because this was way more interesting than a possible snowstorm heading our way in the next few days. Whatever you're imagining right now, it's wrong. I know that's my fault because I'm telling you this story, so I apologize. There were a few key details of this deer I haven't mentioned yet. First, the deer's head was about 7 feet off the ground. And second, I could see through the glass of the front doors that this deer was standing upright. From antler tip to pelvis, the deer was just like any other ordinary white-tailed I'd ever seen in the woods, or on this side of the interstate. Tan fur, long neck, confused expression, but at the legs, it turned into something else. If kangarooish were a word, I would call his legs kangarooish. He stepped a kangarooish foot into the door and waited, like he was making sure the ground wasn't going to fall out below him. When it didn't, he put the next foot forward. The door shut behind him, and the deer started walking around the gas station aisles, his antlers barely missing the fluorescent lights hanging from the ceiling by millimeters. I didn't think much of it at the time, but when I got to work earlier that night, my other coworker said something interesting. I was taking over the safe from our other full-time clerk, Jerry, who, according to what I heard from a very reliable source, has been pretty salty ever since his cult went and had a mass suicide without inviting him. Before he left, he told me that the lag was getting worse and maybe we should do something about it. You see, there's something wrong with the mirror in the gas station bathroom. There's a delay in the reflection by about a half a second. Sometimes if the weather's acting up, it gets more noticeable. We made plans to replace the mirror but couldn't do it, because we're lazy and mirrors are expensive. Besides, how important is it to see your exact reflection anyway? It's a gas station bathroom, not a salon. That wasn't the weird thing he told me though. The weird thing was a man had come in earlier wearing hunter's camo and left his number, telling Jerry that it was imperative that he contact him in case we see anything unusual. I had dismissed this as being too vague to mean anything at all. What's unusual at the gas station? A solar eclipse? A bipedal deer? A completely normal day? Besides, I don't work for him, and if he's looking for the deer creature, he can find it on his own. I watched the deer slowly walk towards the bag chip display and put his nose to it, sniffing vigorously before stepping back and scanning the entire store again. His arms, or front legs, I'm not really sure, dangled at his sides with cloven hoofs as he walked over to the refrigerator drink case. He tapped the glass a couple times with his antlers before figuring out how to reach out and pull the door open. It was like watching a toddler figure out a puzzle. Funny at first, but then just frustrating. I almost got up to help him before finally, mercifully, he got his hand, toe, clove, toe, foot, finger around the handle and the door creaked open. I had to hold back my laughter as the deer fumbled with a bottle of water and somehow managed, barely, to pull it out of the case before sticking the top of it into his jaw and chewing on the cap until it ripped open. The deer leaned his head back, sticking the bottle in his mouth, stared right at me as he guzzled the whole thing down in one continuous stream. Next, the buck sauntered over to the coffee machine and gave it a whiff. The smell apparently didn't gee-haw with his disposition as he reared back and shook his head fiercely. That's probably for the best. Finally, the buck finished his rounds and walked up to me and stopped at the other end of the counter. From this close, I could smell the creature, and surprisingly, he smelled like grape soda. He tapped his hooves, fingers, hands on the counter a couple of times, then looked back to where he had dropped the bottle of water. "Okay," I said. He tapped the counter again. So I went ahead and punched in the code for a bottle of water at the register. That's gonna be 89 cents. The deer took a step back and looked down at himself, then started patting his body where his pockets would be if he were wearing any pants. Then he looked up at me and blinked a few times. "You're putting me in an awkward spot here." Right then, the creature started belting out this strange animalistic noise I can only describe as the combination between a donkey and a dolphin. "I don't know what that means," I said over his noises. But then, he just got louder and louder and threw his head back, emitting a weird call into the ceiling. "I don't know what you're saying," I said back. "I don't speak deer." The creature then threw its head back down and barfed a green, wet clump onto the counter in front of me. Then it went silent. I looked at the clump. The deer looked at the clump. The deer looked at me. Then back to the clump. Oh. I reached out and grabbed it by the corner. Sure enough, the deer had coughed up a mucus-covered $1 bill. Okay. I wiped the sliminess off with the dish rag I kept near the register for spills. Put the bill into the till with the rest of the money, before fishing out 2 nickels and a penny, which I offered to the deer, which the deer promptly ate out of my hand. He turned towards the door, flicked his tail a few times at me before I noticed the strange tableau outside the store. At least half a dozen other deer were out there, each standing tall on 2 kangaroo-ish feet, staring right at me. There was another stag, a pack of doe, at least 1 fawn, only 4 feet tall. The buck struggled for a few seconds to pull the doors open. "Do you want me to?" Before I could finish, he had it wide enough to slip outside. Then they all left, walking proudly towards the forest line. It wasn't until 5 minutes later that it occurred to me that I could have taken a picture or something. But, without any proof, I guess this is just going to turn into another weird story that no one will believe. I dug through my backpack and I found a book I hadn't read yet. Opened it to the first page. It was at least an hour before I had another customer come into the store that night.